Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Sort of Funny Field Guide newsletter. This week, we have a very special guest. She's an award-winning journalist and former foreign correspondent who has reported from more than 15 countries and 6 continents. I've known her via the internet for many years now, but actually got to meet her in person at the Society of Environmental Journalists meeting held in Pittsburgh in 2017. Most recently, she's written a gorgeous book about a topic very near and dear to my heart. It's called 8 Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future. Without further ado, Gloria, Gloria Dickey. Welcome.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you. It's so funny too, actually, that you mentioned that we met at the Pittsburgh meeting, because that's actually where this book began, was at that SEJ Pittsburgh conference with the quick elevator pitch style of this concept to some book editors. So yeah, lots of things happened there.
I remember gravitating to that and you because as a person that mostly writes about animals, a lot of that conference was tangential to my interest, but there were a couple people there that were sort of doing the work that I was interested in. And so whenever I think we were at a hotel bar having a drink and you were talking about this bear book, I was like, yes, tell me more.
Yeah, I think we've gone to some session on like uncharismatic animals as well, like about how you make people care about like slugs. And I felt a little bit guilty with my very charismatic megafauna bear book pitch. So yeah. Nice.
That's okay. There's room for all the animals. So bears, so I'm writing a book about North American wildlife, and I do have a chapter on the grizzly. And so I was very interested to read your chapter on grizzlies. If for those of you who don't own this beautiful book yet, each chapter talks about a different bear species, of which there are 8. So the obvious way to start this as an Office fan would be to ask you, Gloria.
Question: what kind of bear is best?
It's a ridiculous question.
False. Black bear.
Well, that's debatable. There are basically 2 schools of thought.
Fact. Bears eat beets.
Oh.
Bears. Beets. Battlestar Galactica.
Yes, that is the go-to question. I feel like it's a little bit tricky in terms of like choosing between like favorite children at this point. And I always feel like whenever I say which bear is my favorite, like the scientists working on the other bears are gonna be like, oh, like what about the sloth bear? I do like the polar bear the most. I would say I think that stems maybe from being Canadian. I feel like it's very like northern typecast, like the Arctic. But I think too, just they're such an interesting unique bear, like compared to, which actually they're not, because they evolved out of brown bears like 500,000 years ago, which is recent in terms of like bear evolution. So actually very not much a unique bear, but like I think that they just seem so cool. Like they live out on the sea ice. They're considered like a maritime sea like mammal. Like they're not even considered as like a land mammal when you like look at like the US government, like what manages polar bears. And I think too, like just the fact that they are the bear species that in many ways, even though their population is decently high right now, that the bear species that's the most in trouble, which I think kind of creates this like tragic fondness for this bear.
You've traveled all over the world for this book, which is incredible. It must have been an amazing experience. Is there like one place or person or experience that like you just wake up in the night thinking about, or you daydream about going back to? Or
yeah, I mean there's obviously a bunch. There's probably 2 that come to mind, like one in a good way and like one in a bad way. I think I often think about some of the kind of family bear bile farming operations that I visited in Vietnam. Bear bile, which is what the liquid that forms in your gallbladder. Humans have bile, and they actually have the kind of active ingredient, if you will, that bears have as well, but in much smaller doses. And so people tap into their gallbladders. There's different kind of grotesque mechanisms for getting the bile out. It used to be that they would just completely like poach and kill the bear and carve out its gallbladder. Nowadays in Vietnam, for example, they keep the bears in cages. They knock them out every few weeks. They extract the bile, and then people will drink it. They'll rub it on their joints. They think it's like a traditional cure, and it does actually have some medicinal properties, but that's not typically how people are using it. And so it's pretty widespread, most common in China, where it's like $1 billion industry, I think, and much more at a kind of industrial level. But in Vietnam, it's more so like families might have a few bears for their bile supply. There was one farm that we stopped by, and you could only like initially see like the first row of like maybe 4 or 5 of these like moon bears that were in cages. And then you kind of get closer, and there's like almost 30 bears that are kept in like these sidewalk cages on this one farm. And the first bear was like, just kind of sadly looking out onto the street. That's probably all he'd seen for years in this tiny little cage. And then when I came back out from the farm later, he'd like turned around and all of his or her fur was gone on the backside, like just from sitting on these bars. And so I think a lot about that bear and just in terms of like how long they live. I'm like, that bear might very well still just be sitting in that cage, which is really distressing. And I think for a positive experience that sticks with me, I guess, I mean, there were a lot. I mean, chasing bears around the world is a pretty good job to have. But I think probably I went to visit Huayquecha Biological Station, which is in the cloud forests of Peru, and to look for the spectacled bear, Paddington, or the Andean bear. And that was a really, really neat trip. I spent a few days there with scientists who had all these camera traps set up throughout the cloud forest, looking for like which parts of the forest the bears were using. We didn't actually see a bear, which was, I mean, that's typically how it goes with these sorts of things. The harder you look, like the less likely you are to see one. But it was just such a magical ecosystem. You could see how important like clouds and moisture was to all the plants, like growing on parts of other plants. There were tons of hummingbirds, just like you could hear the air like humming with the vibrations of their wings. So it was a really beautiful, pristine kind of place to visit. And I think, most people wouldn't even think that a bear could live in that kind of, environment. So that's another one that sticks out.
Having written the book on bears now, you probably know more about bears than most people who are not studying them for a living. What sorts of misconceptions would you like to dispel for just the average person out there who just knows about bears, just rattling around in the back of their head?
Sure. I mean, I think the most common when you think of 8 bears is the fact that most people think that there's only 4 species, and most people think that they're kind of like restricted to North America or like Europe. They don't think that there's bears in Asia. They don't think that there's bears in South America. So I think that that's kind of like the first thing that I often hear is people be like, okay, brown bear, grizzly bear, which is subspecies, not a distinct species for your references, I'm sure you know, and black bear and polar bear. And they kind of, maybe they'll say the panda, and then they often say, oh, the panda's not a real bear. And like everyone says that to me. They're like, oh, pandas aren't bears. I'm like, well, what do you think they are? And they are bears. I think they get confused with red pandas. So they always second guess themselves. So yes, pandas are bears. We actually didn't know that for certain until like the 1980s because they couldn't do DNA testing. So I think they thought it was like the raccoon family, the cat family. They didn't really know. It's true, they didn't know what the panda was. So that's another one. I guess the other one that I hear a lot, polar bears and brown bears being like the most deadly species, which I guess depending on like how you measure like how deadly a bear species is, they are in the proportion of perhaps like the number of attacks to like how many attacks are fatal. But the sloth bear in India is actually like the world's deadliest bear in terms of how many people it kills every year. And I mean, a lot of people will be like, oh, well, that's because the sloth bear lives near, millions of people in close proximity, right? But that's not completely true. They're also just a very aggressive bear, and they have kind of a low throttle point, if you will. So they do, they're used to fighting with tigers on the landscape. They're quite aggressive if you were to run into one. So they do have a pretty high, the other thing that's crazy about sloth bears is I often get news alerts where it's like 4 people will be attacked and killed by like one sloth bear in one incident. Like I can't think of like another bear where it's like they just kill multiple people at once or like viciously attack multiple people at once. And it's actually pretty common with sloth bears. So yeah, those are the ones. Did you want to talk? You mentioned the kind of
So
menstrual
I do think
bloods.
that there's that lore in like outdoors backpacker lore that women that are menstruating shouldn't go into the woods because grizzlies will hunt you down. And in fact, in your book, you have a section on this, so maybe you can inform the rest of us.
We can
Can you go in the woods on your period?
Bears and periods, yes, a fun topic. So that I think that's that kind of urban legend, if you will, grew out of these attacks that happened in Montana, where 2 women were attacked and killed by grizzly bears on the same night. I think it was back in the late 1960s or 70s, and after that, they were trying to find a motivation for the attack. They kind of overlooked the fact that they were like near garbage and human food, and that like these bears were showing like food habituation, and they were like, oh, they were both on their period. So clearly, like the bears were attracted to the menstrual blood and came in and like brutally killed these women. And that myth kind of persisted for quite some time. And it was even to the point where like women were discouraged from working for the National Park Service and like working in the backwoods. And I think there were regulations and limits placed on that because of this concern that women menstruating would be attacked by bears. And funnily enough, they actually did do an experiment years later to look like, I don't know how they facilitated this experiment. And, I guess it was captive bears, and they had some volunteers give their used menstrual products to the to the bears, but they did find that while brown bears and black bears didn't really show any increase in interest, polar bears actually were attracted to the menstrual blood. So I guess that's maybe avoid Arctic camping at that time of the month.
And not to, speculate too much, but polar bears being the most carnivorous bear species, maybe they're more attuned to blood. I don't know.
It's possible. Yeah, they're sniffing. See, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Very interesting. The other thing I wanted you to tell us was a story, some people will know, but I do love that the teddy bear supposedly, originated out of a story from a real bear here in the United States. Can you give us the brief rundown of the origin of the teddy bear?
Sure, the Sparks Notes versions. Yeah, so most people know who Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt was. So essentially, the teddy bear comes out of one of his bear hunting expeditions in the early 1900s. He was in Mississippi, so with some friends, and I think he'd fallen behind the group. They'd run ahead, his kind of hunting guides, his friends with the dog. So they were up way ahead of Teddy, and they came across this black bear. And the bear attacked the dog they had in their party, and so they were like, no, like, but let's wait for Teddy to like give him the honor of like killing this bear. And they tied the little bear to a tree, and they're like, okay, we'll just wait for Teddy to come in and like finish it off. And so when he finally entered the scene, he was like, no, like that's not very, it's not good sportsmanship. Like I will let this bear live. Allegedly, he then asked his companions to just like kill the bear with a knife instead. Like it, I think that part often gets left out of the story, but somehow this story made its way back to the newspaper offices, and someone drew a political cartoon called "Drawing the Line in Mississippi," where Teddy spares his little bear's life. A toy maker then allegedly saw this little cartoon. It was kind of the first manifestation. You can find the cartoon online, but it was the first manifestation where like the bear had like really little round ears and was like quite cute and teddy bearish looking, right? So someone turned the teddy bear into a toy, allegedly inspired by this drawing, and it changed the way that we looked at bears forever.
Really, really interesting stuff. We could talk probably for hours about what's in this book. And so I would highly recommend checking out 8 Bears. Maybe that will not be backwards whenever we publish this. But a closing thought, in the epilogue, you mentioned that of the 8 bear species, there are really 3 that have a pretty secured future going forward, and the other 5 are in significant danger. And I found it really interesting which 3 they were. So black bears, I don't think are a surprise because they're very prominent, especially here in the United States. We have to manage their populations. They're doing well. Brown bears, a little more surprising from a United States perspective because the historic range is so much less than it used to be. But because of Canada and Alaska, they're doing okay. The third bear, I don't think any person would guess, and it's pandas. Maybe you can explain why you include them in this list.
Sure. I mean, that might kind of just be my own train of thought. And because true, panda bears have like the lowest population. There are fewer than 2,000 pandas that we know of in the wild. But I think when you think of like the resources that have gone into panda conservation, when you think about the fact that it's China, like China, can you imagine if China like let the panda bear go extinct? I don't think that's going to happen. They've put so much investment into it. They've created Giant Panda National Park, which is like this massive land set aside for pandas in its home range. Like most of panda habitat will be protected, I think, within a few years. And you know what? The pandas survived like China's peak population, right? Like China's population is going down. The bears managed to hang on through that. So I think that, China's getting more wild space. They put so much money and time and attention into this issue. I think more money has been spent on panda conservation than any other single species. It's the flagship animal of the World Wildlife Fund. Like there's just so much riding on this one species. It gets so much attention so that even though its numbers are low, I just don't see a future where it's like, oh no, like, oh darn, like pandas are gone, And I mean, maybe that doesn't mean that they exist in like huge wild populations, but at least I guess in the breeding facilities, they exist. They're trying to introduce some of those captive red bears into the wild now. So I do feel like hope. When I left China, I felt a lot of hope for like panda conservation and what would happen to panda bears.
Excellent. I think that's the happy note we want to end on because there are plenty of directions we could go that are less happy. 8 Bears, Gloria Dickey, thank you so much for coming on the newsletter show, whatever this is. This book comes out July 11th, correct?
Yes, and I would just like to comment how perfectly it matches your t-shirt. I feel like it's kind of a similar, one's a little more vicious looking, but yeah.
Definitely had to wear my bear gear.
US.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gloria. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.